Most people agree that the worst thing you can do to a joke is explain it. As E.B. White famously said, analyzing humor is like dissecting a frog. Few people are interested, and the frog dies. Of course, that hasn't stopped every kind of Russian linguist, French philosopher, and German psychoanalyst from laying into that frog with sadistic relish. Humor research is a wide, interdisciplinary academic field, and anyone who's spent any time in it at all knows how hard it is to analyze a joke without ending up sounding like this.
I see. So the difficulty in attaining such complex positioning is what makes this anecdote so amusing. Yes, very humorous indeed.
The point is, for those of us who aren't emotionless androids, humor is self-explanatory. If you have to explain why a joke works, that's probably because it doesn't, right? But that doesn't address why comedy is so often subjective, polarizing, and even controversial. Maybe there's no need to explain why something is funny when everyone agrees that it is, but what about when half the audience thinks something is hilarious and the other half thinks it's stupid, offensive, or even disgusting?
Eric, did you just take a crap on my desk?
Well, that's when it's time to dissect the frog. Sorry, frog. So, speaking of gross incisions, I was recently rewatching Jermaine Clement and Taika Waititi's vampire mockumentary, What We Do in the Shadows, which happens to be one of my favorite comedy films of all time. When I got to the scene and suddenly wondered, why am I even laughing at this?
Shit!
What's wrong with me? Okay, well, before we start delving into my deep-seated psychological issues, let's step back and get a little perspective. Before we can understand why we laugh at something specifically, we have to understand why we laugh at things generally. In his 1998 book, Phantoms in the Brain, neuroscientist Vilayanur S. Ramachandran describes the cases of patients who suddenly died while laughing uncontrollably. These people were later found to have suffered hemorrhages in the thalamus or hypothalamus regions of their brains. And based on these cases, Ramachandran concluded that there must be a laughter circuit in the limbic system, the part of the brain that controls fear and aggression. What does laughter have to do with fear and aggression? Ramachandran argues that when a person is exposed to a sudden, unexpected stimulus, the limbic system registers a potential threat and triggers an alarm signal in the brain. Then, when the person suddenly realizes that the perceived threat is actually something trivial or harmless, the alarm turns into relief and is discharged as laughter. According to Ramachandran, laughter may have evolved as a way to quickly communicate to others that some strange, unexpected thing or event is not dangerous. For example, a person who falls over laughs to indicate to others that he's not hurt. That's why laughter is a vocalization. That's why it's contagious. And that's why we laugh more in groups than we do when we're alone. Just as a scream communicates alarm, a laugh communicates false alarm. It's the universal signal that says, stand down, everything is fine. So, speaking of alarms, let's get back to vampires. Most of the humor of What We Do in the Shadows comes from the basic premise: a group of vampires sharing a flat in New Zealand and behaving more or less like regular schmucks. The jokes come from the unexpected juxtaposition of classic horror cliches with images of mundanity and routine. We see the four flatmates knitting, vacuuming, arguing about whose turn it is to do the dishes, all in the manner of immortal vampires.
I will do my dishes! Good to do that!
The opening shot is a great example of this style of humor. If we use the alarm, false alarm model of laughter, we can break the joke down into two parts. First, we have the familiar, frightening image of a vampiric hand creeping out of a coffin, a horror trope that's been around since Todd Browning's 1931 classic Dracula. Then we have this, the image of a hand hitting the snooze button on an alarm clock, a shot that traditionally indicates mundane daily routine. The reason this joke works is because the audience's associations with this part of the image are subverted by their associations with this part. In other words, it's possible the reason we think vampires are funny is because we think they're scary. Personally, I like to call this the Bogart theory of laughter, after the famous scene in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban where students are taught to transform their greatest fear into something silly by adding something trivial to it. For instance, putting an old woman's hat on an intimidating professor or roller skates on a giant spider. Put simply, the basic formula for funny seems to be scary plus trivial equals
ridiculous.
Ramachandran theorizes that, over time, the kind of stimuli that could be interpreted by the brain as potentially threatening could have expanded to include things like verbal threats, or threats to social norms, or threats to logic, basically any threat to our ideas about how the world should operate. In linguistics, this is called the benign violation theory of humor, the idea that any kind of violation, a violation of norms, a violation of expectations, even a violation of the laws of physics, can produce laughter as long as it's also basically harmless. To put it another way, we laugh at what we perceive to be wrong as long as it's not bad. And you can see how this natural human tendency to laugh at the harmlessly unexpected could evolve into some really unusual or niche forms of humor. For example, Monty Python famously pioneered a style of sketch comedy that was based on avoiding classical joke structure. The violation here was that the audience expected a punchline or an explanation, but didn't get one.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not prepared to pursue my line of inquiry any further, as I think this is getting too silly.
So far, so straightforward. But if all comedy more or less boils down to this one simple formula, then why is it still so subjective? Why do people so often disagree on what is or isn't funny? Well, maybe it's because the parts of this formula are themselves subjective. After all, wrongness and badness aren't universal concepts. They're difficult to define, and they're heavily influenced by cultural context and personal perception. Let's talk about wrongness. Wrongness is about context. In order to identify something as wrong, you first have to know what's right. Arguably, this is why comedy films are so notoriously difficult to export. The idea is that culturally specific humor just doesn't translate well for international audiences. Wordplay is a very good example of this. You have to understand a language well enough to know what the correct phrase is before you can laugh at the wrong one.
I think the phrase rhymes with clucking bell.
But language isn't the only issue here. I was recently watching the classic Marx Brothers comedy A Night at the Opera with a group of English-speaking Europeans. For most of the film, we were all on the same page, but when we got to this scene, let's take a look. Okay, for the non-Americans out there, let me explain what's going on. The song you're hearing is Take Me Out to the Ball Game, a song traditionally sung at baseball games. Because I was raised in America, I instantly recognized this tune as the unofficial anthem of a sport that epitomizes American mass culture. This is actually a very good example of a benign violation. It's an intrusion of the most universally accessible low culture, baseball, into the most exclusive and elite form of high culture, the opera. But my European friends didn't know the tune. Sure, they understood something strange was going on, but they didn't get why it was so wrong, so they didn't get why it was so funny. And even after I explained it to them, they weren't particularly amused.
Well, I wouldn't know about that. I haven't been in Canada in years.
And that's the point. To qualify as a joke, the wrong thing can't just be slightly wrong. It has to be egregiously wrong, wrong enough to produce a visceral response, wrong enough to trigger the false alarm circuit in your limbic system. For example, say you're watching a movie about Robin Hood that's set in the 12th century, and somebody pulls out a refracting telescope, and you happen to know that the refracting telescope wasn't invented until the early 17th century. Well, that's a mistake. But if you're watching a movie about Robin Hood and somebody pulls out one of these, that's a joke. In other words, it's not enough to know something is wrong. It has to feel wrong, instinctively, and it takes time and experience to build up those kinds of associations. Okay, maybe Groucho Marx shouting peanuts at the opera is a fairly benign violation. Yes, boundaries are being crossed, but unless you're a real stickler for opera-related etiquette, you'll probably agree it isn't morally bad. But in humor, as in life, the divide between wrong and bad is less of a clear line and more of a sliding scale. The entire field of ethics exists because morality is neither clear-cut nor universal. And since humor is, by definition, transgressive, a lot of jokes are going to wander into, shall we say, a gray area.
Hitler on ice!
But what about when something is unambiguously bad? Why is this funny?
Shit!
Most of us can instinctively understand why this is, as we might say, wrong on multiple levels. The first part of the humor equation is definitely being met. But what about the second one? There's nothing benign about this. Unlike the scene at the opera, someone is clearly, unambiguously getting hurt. So why is it funny?
Well, that didn't go so great. On the upside, I think she had a really good time.
One of the theories that gets tossed around humor studies a lot is the superiority theory of laughter, which was first proposed by Plato and Aristotle. According to these philosophers, we laugh at other people's misfortune because their perceived inferiority makes us feel superior by comparison. Personally, I've never liked this theory. Even putting aside the disturbing idea that laughter is basically a sociopathic impulse, the superiority theory of laughter doesn't explain why we're able to laugh at ourselves, or why for the most part we tend to be upset rather than amused when we see someone seriously hurt in real life. Now that's an important distinction. Usually when we laugh at someone else's misfortune, there's something unreal about the situation. Either the person isn't really hurt,
Just a flesh wound.
or the person isn't really real. There are no serious injuries in Looney Tunes land. The characters bounce right back, so why shouldn't we laugh at an incongruous image? That's the point. I don't think that it's people we laugh at. It's images. That's why the thought of somebody getting hit by a car isn't funny, but the thought of somebody getting hit by an ambulance is a little more amusing. It's not the person we're laughing at. It's the image. How does a person, in all their complexity, get reduced to an image? We all know the old cliché that comedy is tragedy plus time, the understanding being that distance, not just temporal distance, but psychological distance, is necessary in order for a tragic event to become unreal and therefore funny. A 1997 study found that there was a negative correlation between emotional empathy and enjoyment of aggressive and devaluing humor. According to the study, those most likely to devalue others in a humor situation also score low on empathy for others experiencing problems. So yes, there is evidence to support that laughing at someone and empathizing with them are mutually exclusive. But that's not necessarily as bad as it sounds. In black comedy, humor is often used as a way to deal with difficult issues. For example, many sociologists think that the strange and sudden popularity of grisly dead baby jokes in the 1960s, yes, this was a thing, was a coping mechanism to deal with the sudden increase in contraception and abortion, as well as the rising death toll in Vietnam. Humor was being deliberately used to invoke cognitive dissonance and lower empathy, turning something scary and serious into just a joke. But I think we can all agree that there's a line. For instance, you probably wouldn't tell a dead baby joke to a couple that had just lost a child. Why not? Well, because in that situation, the baby isn't just an image. It's real. Okay, But dead baby jokes are a little bit dated these days. Let's look at something more current. What about rape jokes? Is a rape joke a harmless coping mechanism or a sociopathic impulse? Let's take a look at one. Assuming the benign violation theory of humor, what is the violation here? You might say, well, rape itself is a violation, and that would certainly make the joke seem sociopathic because it treats the rape victim's suffering as benign, even funny. Or you might say that the violation here isn't the act of rape, but the violation of social norms by suddenly bringing up the word rape in a joke. The threat to social order is the image of rape, the word rape. In other words, the shocking intrusion of a serious and taboo subject into a polite or humorous discussion, just like the shocking intrusion of baseball into an opera house. So whether or not you find this joke funny depends entirely on how you read it, and that depends on whether you perceive rape to be an act or a word, a reality or an image. For women, usually, rape is a far from hypothetical idea. Most women have either experienced some form of sexual violence firsthand or know someone who has. And all women live with a very real fear of sexual violence in our daily lives. So for most women, rape is a real thing that happens to real people, not a hypothetical thing that happens to hypothetical people, which means this joke may seem a little sociopathic. If you're a man, on the other hand, who hasn't experienced sexual assault first or even secondhand, you may be more likely to think of rape as an ugly image or a controversial conversation topic. An idea, in other words. A horrible idea, but an idea like the Spanish Inquisition or Elizabethan executions, something that's just too far away from your experience of reality to seem real. Of course, we absolutely shouldn't discount the influence of cultural misogyny on some men's ability or inability to empathize with women. But the point I'm trying to make is that whether we perceive a person's suffering as real or funny is largely determined by our personal and cultural experience. Personally, I'd be curious to see if rape jokes become less popular in the post-Weinstein era. And this has nothing to do with political correctness. It has to do with perspective, because what was once an abstract idea in the public consciousness has suddenly become a lot more real to a lot more people. I know this is a controversial example, but I think it's important to look at controversial examples because it's only when we understand why people disagree about whether or not something is funny that we can understand the cultural perspectives that make some things funny to everyone. After all, we all know vampires aren't real, so why should their victims be? The point is, humor is strange and divisive and subjective and controversial, but that's not what makes it confusing. That's what makes it revealing. This formula doesn't just tell us a lot about humor. It tells us a lot about people. Because in the end, the best way to understand a joke is to look around and see who's laughing and who's not. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed. Just a reminder that these videos aren't monetized, so if you'd like to find me on Patreon, the link is in the description. Every little bit is so appreciated, and many thanks to the patrons who are already helping to make these videos possible. And I'm looking forward to talking to you soon.